Okay, so before we talk about Gorbachev's reforms, I'd like to tell you a little story about Gorbachev, and this really sums up what he stood for and what basically his intentions were, but how his intentions always turned out. Okay, so when Gorbachev first came to power in 1985, right, he was quite a young guy with a massive scar on his head. Yeah, he was quite a young guy, very optimistic, and he really wanted to change the Soviet Union. And what happened was that one of his main priorities when he came into power was to tackle the problem of alcohol. Okay, basically, Russians, as you know, they loved to drink vodka, and when he first came into power, he realized that about 1/6 to 1/7 of the population were officially considered to be alcoholic, okay, which was about 40 out of 270 million, I think, were officially considered alcoholic. But I think this is a very, very low estimate, and basically there was a tremendous reliance on alcohol in the Soviet Union. Okay, and what happened was that he quickly implemented policies to eradicate this problem of alcohol. So what he did was to ensure that the price of vodka was trebled, so times three, okay, to make it more expensive for people to buy, and therefore, in the hope that more people would start to turn away from alcohol. And things like beer, for example, okay, the production of beer was basically reduced by about 3/4, which was essentially very, very low. Okay, so basically, what happened was that, okay, to Gorbachev's horror, although these were very, very meaningful kind of changes that he sought to make, to his horror, what happened was that he realized soon that there were outside these shops, licensed shops, which sold alcohol, for example. He would find long, long queues, okay, outside. And what happened was that many people also resorted to coming up with their own breweries at home. So they would basically brew their own alcohol at home and also get alcohol from this thing called the black market, which I think you are all quite familiar with as well. Okay, so basically it was really, really horrible, and he found out that the amount of alcohol-related deaths increased as a result of his policies, because a lot of people who brewed their own alcohol didn't do it properly, and a lot of them died from alcohol poisoning. Okay, and okay, just to sum up, basically Gorbachev had a lot of good intentions when he came into power, but some of his policies, which were very well intentioned, turned out to backfire. Okay, and although he had good intentions, his policies, when implemented, turned out to be massive, massive failures.
Okay, so talking about Gorbachev's failures, okay, Gorbachev's reforms and intentions. Yes, we're looking at the short term over here. So Gorbachev, yes, he did have wonderful, noble intentions. He wanted to reform the Soviet Union, to make the Soviet Union, which looked like it was going to collapse very soon, make it a lasting kind of establishment. Okay, so what Gorbachev did, basically three things that he did, and you must know these three things. It's not difficult actually to remember these three main points. So firstly, Glasnost, perestroika, and foreign policy reforms. So again, we look at how these linked to the immediate causes of the end of the Cold War. So we're going to look at Glasnost first over here. So basically, Glasnost basically means openness. So Glasnost was put in place to encourage openness, so that when there's open discussion, when people could talk openly and really discuss the problems openly without fear, real progress can be made, progress that can actually drive the Soviet Union on. So how did this openness take shape? So a few measures were put in place. Alright, so firstly, there was a freedom of speech and expression that was allowed, unprecedented in Soviet times. So basically, previous leaders, they were all quite hardliners. They would never have allowed such freedom of speech and expression. Okay, so this took the form of public debates, for example, a very big one in 1986, and therefore, when people could debate in public about the problems that communism was facing, what happens is suddenly people realize that the communist system is no longer actually perfect. The fact that people can be in public talking about its problems. And when people no longer see communism as perfect, what happens is that the system becomes very vulnerable. People realize that, oh, it's not perfect, it's flawed. In fact, it may be the the wrong way to go. And therefore, this could also be linked to dissolution of the USSR, because what happened is that people had an increasing desire for a change in the political system. Maybe communism doesn't work after all, they began to think. Okay, and besides public debates, there was also reduced censorship in the press, which is in newspapers, and in books that were being published as well. So basically, because of this, there was an increased opposition. So opposition could be aired more openly, and there was a very outward questioning of the communist system. And again, people no longer saw it as perfect. Maybe that was the wrong way to go again, and this contributed to this desire for a change in the political system, which eventually caused communism to collapse. Okay, and also Western radio and films were increasingly permitted. So films like Easy Rider, music from the Rolling Stones, for example, they were permitted. Okay, in the USSR, and basically people were now exposed to all the good things that the West had. Okay, Western prosperity, for example, the cars they enjoyed, the game shows they were watching, the music they listened to. And so Soviet people looked at themselves and realized that, wow, our standard of living is so much poorer. And therefore they became very unhappy with their own situation. And therefore they looked at the system and they thought, wow, why is their system able to give them prosperity, whereas ours isn't? So again, it made people rethink the communist system, and again, a lot of people started to desire real and concrete change. Okay, there was also a release of political prisoners. Basically, Gorbachev did this to just show people that, hey, if you were to speak up against the government, if you were to really try to fight for reforms, don't worry, we will not arrest you. Okay, relax. Okay, so he released political prisoners. So what happened was that when he did that, not only did he invite these people who had opposing voices back into the frame, he also encouraged others to not be fearful and to also offer their own suggestions, their own recommendations, which may actually again undermine Communist Party doctrine. Okay, and there's also a release of classified information, especially information with regard to purges, especially those during Stalin's time, and also about production. And we realized that a lot of production figures were actually falsified over the years. Basically, people were reporting untrue figures. Okay, figures that were inflated that made the Soviet Union look a lot better than it actually was in the past, and therefore we'll find that people realize that they've been lied to. Basically, a lot of people found had lost their relatives and friends for many years, and then they eventually found out that they had actually been purged under Stalin. This basically caused a lot of resentment and anger in the people. Okay, they were being lied to all these years. And also there's a reconstruction of Soviet history. Last time Stalin used to be viewed as a god, for example, but now he was seen as a flawed leader, someone that could have improved in certain ways. So again, people started questioning the system, which they didn't really do before. They were not used to it. But Glasnost, in promoting openness, basically encouraged this thinking, this rethinking of the Soviet Union, rethinking of the communist system itself and whether it is the right way to go. Okay, so there was a tremendous impact on the wider Cold War, because what happened was that many, having been exposed to all this, being exposed to these classified information, freedom of speech and expression, they realized that the government had been lying to them all the time. And looking at the West, they felt that their own system had deprived them of the freedom and prosperity that was being enjoyed in the West. For example, remember we looked at the lack of consumer goods in the Soviet Union. Yeah, when they looked at the West, they looked at West Germany, looked at America, and realized that wow, this is what we are lacking. Okay, and this made people lose faith in the communist vision because communism had promised so much over the years but had delivered so little, and this made people want a change in the system. And this helped to bring about a fall in communism because basically people became more and more opposed to the idea of communism. They had lost faith in the entire idea. So this desire of change basically again led to the dissolution of the USSR, which eventually led to the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War, essentially. Okay, so I hope you're able to draw the link. So Glasnost as a policy, as an approach, really did a lot to bring an end to the Cold War. Okay. Next up, we're going to look at perestroika. Okay, perestroika essentially means restructuring. Okay, so there's economic perestroika and political perestroika. We'll look at economic restructuring or perestroika first. So basically what Gorbachev aimed to do was to create greater interest and productivity in the Soviet Union. Remember, the economy was in such a bad state, it was unproductive, people were not interested in working harder than they needed to. And basically, he wanted to give people a sense of ownership, the fact they owned the economy, they owned their own livelihood, so that when people have a sense of ownership, they're more likely to put in more effort, okay, to come up with ways to to do different things, to work harder. And if you're working harder, you're more productive, and you're more productive, the economy will improve as a whole. Okay, so what did Gorbachev do? Okay, basically he allowed private ownership in several sectors, for example, some manufacturing sectors, the service sector. So people were allowed to own their own enterprises. Okay, so these private enterprises were set up, and there's a degree of freedom when it came to setting of prices. So now the government no longer told you how much you can sell this thing for. You're allowed to set your own prices. So again, it gives people a sense of ownership, and now that you can set your own prices, right, you'll be able to be more motivated to work because you realize that you don't need to, you can sell it for a price higher, so you can earn more money, right? So you have more incentive to work harder. There's also a relaxation of control over wages. So now that now employers have more control over wages. So if you can pay your worker more, they'll be more willing to work harder, for example. So basically increasing motivation in the workers to promote productivity. So what were the results of perestroika? Basically not very positive ones, unfortunately, for Gorbachev. A lot of these private enterprises proved to be unprofitable. So when they're unprofitable and not making enough money, they needed government support. So a lot of them relied on government subsidies, and again, the government itself was already doing so badly, but yet it had to come up with money to support these private enterprises that were unprofitable. So again, failure because people were not able to stand on their own 2 feet. Again, the government also owned factors of production, basically things that are needed to produce things like trucks, tractors. And because the government owned these factors of production, what happened was that there were a lot of corrupt officials because now these officials can try to take bribes so that, for example, A and B, they both set up private enterprises, they both need trucks. But if A decides to give a larger bribe than B, basically A gets the trucks, A gets the tractors, for example. So people start to deal with corrupt officials. And they also had to pay high taxes in order to enjoy these technologies, like, okay, these factors of production. And because of that, people lost interest in setting up their own private businesses. They had to deal with corrupt officials, they had to deal with high taxes. My goodness, it is rubbish. So basically, people didn't feel a sense of ownership because people didn't see the point in having their own businesses anymore. And also, because of these productions, there was also shortages of food and other basic necessities, which were basically a result of very poor economic planning. And again, this caused people to be very unhappy. So perestroika, although as an economic policy hoped to create greater interest and productivity, basically it seemed to not work at all. And so perestroika failed to achieve its desired outcomes. As a result, people found that, Gorbachev said that, uh, if we put in these changes, we can save the Soviet system. But realized that, wow, even these changes cannot save the Soviet system. It is still as bad. So people became even more upset with the system and increased the desire for change. So again, you link this desire for change to the dissolution of the USSR eventually. Okay, so I hope this is very clear to you. Alright, so this economic perestroika. Now we're going to look at political perestroika. And basically, the Communist Party was seen by a lot of people as being out of touch, useless, unable to solve any problems. So Gorbachev wanted to change this perception. He wanted to make the Communist Party a different one, something that is relevant and useful and good and credible. So what he tried to do was to now hold elections on the local party level. So now people at a local level can vote for their own party members to have a bigger say in who they wanted to rule over their locality, basically. Okay, so get people to have more say. Okay, and because of this, there'll be better officials being put on the podium. And also he called for general elections to be held in 1989. And he said that, for this general elections for change, non-members of the Communist Party could be elected. Wow, suddenly non-communist members could actually be elected into government. So wow, suddenly there was a chance that opposing voices for reform could be ushered into the government. So what kind of results were there because of these political measures? Gorbachev was criticized by hardliners by doing too much to change the system, and liberals for not doing enough to change for the system. So he was attacked from all over the place, and basically a lot of them found that he was an inadequate, inept leader. And what happened in the larger Cold War, scheme of the larger Cold War, was that the 1989 elections were very, very important because they paved the way for various opposition groups to appear legally in the Soviet Union and to appear in the government itself. Okay, and basically what they did was to challenge the existing Communist Party, and which led to the eventual downfall of the Communist Party, because when you have these guys who are the opposition, who are proposing changes, the communist government, which was already so unpopular and which was seen as being unable to solve any of the problems, people will start looking at these opposition groups and looking for alternate way of governing the country. So again, the desire for political change, which led to the dissolution of USSR. So someone like Boris Yeltsin, who felt that the Communist Party was useless, was out of touch, irrelevant. People like him could be voted into power to basically deliver this particular change in the communist system, to make the system collapse and introduce a new form of government in Russia later on. Okay, and finally, we're going to look at foreign policy reforms. Okay, there was an improvement in US-Soviet relationships as a result of Gorbachev's reforms, as embodied by the song by Billy Joel. Okay, so basically, when Gorbachev came into power, he wanted to improve relations with the West, and this was so that he could reduce military tensions. Remember, Reagan had put in the arms race, and the USA was very strong militarily. So when you reduce military tensions, you don't have to spend as much on the military. And if you spend less on the military, you can spend more on things like consumer goods, which will make people happy with the Soviet system. Instead of being spent on weapons, you spend on things like foodstuffs, cars, electronics, clothing, okay, things like that. Okay, and basically Gorbachev followed this thing called the New Thinking. Okay, so the New Thinking basically put forth the idea that global problems could be solved based on shared principles. So instead of looking at the differences, both the USA and the USSR can look at shared principles, things that they can agree on, okay, in order to help to solve global problems, instead of always thinking about the conflict between capitalism and communism. So these were a few of the things Gorbachev did as a means of basically implementing his foreign policy reform. So firstly, he negotiated with Reagan. Remember, he was young. He was open to speaking to Reagan, okay, which Reagan couldn't really do with his predecessors because people they kept dying at old age. Remember, so what happens with Gorbachev and Reagan? They got along relatively well, and one of the things they really talked about was nuclear disarmament. Okay, and basically, both Reagan and Gorbachev wanted to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons in the world, which led to this signing of the INF Treaty, which is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which agreed to remove all nuclear forces, nuclear weapons that were stationed as a result of Able Archer in 1983. Okay, and this basically set the stage for the START one, okay, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty one in 1991, which Gorbachev signed with Reagan's successor, who was George Bush Sr. Okay, basically this instead of limiting the arms, basically they actually wanted to reduce the number of arms in the world, and by 2001, 2002, the amount of nuclear weapons that were deployed all over the world had reduced by about 80%. So it's really relatively successful, actually. Okay, and remember when we look at nuclear disarmament, the end of nuclear disarmament, we can also again look at the end of the nuclear arms race. So these negotiations with Reagan basically helped to bring the nuclear arms race to an end, which slowly ushered in the end of the Cold War, okay, which was really characterized by nuclear war and the danger of nuclear war, I mean. Okay, so Gorbachev also decided to ideologize, okay, Soviet foreign policy. And what this meant was that Gorbachev said that the Soviet Union will stop intervention in countries to support communist regimes or revolutions. So they started in Afghanistan. So after 9 years of grueling battle in Afghanistan, which took a lot of lives and took a lot of resources, Gorbachev started to withdraw troops in 1988, and this was to be completed by 1989. So again, who would this please? America, of course, because America was opposed to the intervention over here. So again, this promoted better relations, which helped to increase cooperation between the superpowers. And he took another step in this UN speech in December 1988, where he talked about people having their own right to determine their own political or economic systems. So when people in Eastern Europe heard about this, they realized that, wow, okay, this guy seems to understand us. And furthermore, Gorbachev said that I will now withdraw and demobilize troops, Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. So what he did here, son, is basically to remove and do away with the Brezhnev doctrine altogether. Okay, so what happened with now you no more troops, opposition groups in Eastern Europe and in the satellites will be more likely to grow. Okay, so again, when you withdraw troops, you withdraw the use of force, that we increase opposition. Okay, and increased opposition here, of course, would later have greater repercussions. So we look at the greater impact of Gorbachev's foreign policies. Okay, we look at how the new thinking basically hastened or quickened the disintegration of the communist bloc. Because, for example, his UN speech helped to usher in a period of change, period of political change, because suddenly he said that you have the right to determine your own political system, and I'm also going to withdraw troops. So, wow, they had very little reason to stick to an unsuccessful, unpopular communist system when it comes to looking at the satellite states over here. So basically, this contributed to the 1989 collapse of communism in parts of Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, Poland, East Germany, all these countries fell one by one. Basically, they did away with communism one by one. Okay, simply because there was no more force, okay, that would stop them and would help to hold communism up. And also, there was, because of his foreign policy reforms, there's increased cooperation with the USA, and this helped to bring the nuclear arms race to an end, and basically helped to usher in the end of the Cold War, because now the Cold War was no longer characterized by nuclear danger, nuclear arms race anymore. Okay, so if we look at Gorbachev's reforms, okay, just very quickly, you realize that these are very short-term reforms, and basically things like U.S. economic strengths and Soviet weaknesses, these help to set the stage, being the long-term factors, to set the stage for Gorbachev's short-term reforms, which then contributed to the more immediate causes. So, for example, the dissolution of the USSR, which basically found that the communist system couldn't hold, and also the fall of the communist bloc. So you must learn to draw the links between these long-term factors, these short-term factors, and these immediate causes, okay, which then basically precipitated the end of the Cold War. Okay, so if you have any questions, please ask me. This is quite a long chapter, but it's a very important one because for last year's O-levels, it did not feature at all. Okay. Okay, thank you.